Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk of the Mathematical Consciousness Science online seminar series held in 2020. This seminar series aims to explore the role of mathematics in the scientific study of consciousness and hopes to connect researchers who have an interest in this topic. While every session of the seminar consists of a talk and discussions, the latter are not recorded and the following will only contain the talk. We hope you will enjoy it. For further information, please visit our website, seminar.math-consciousness.org.
Although this webinar is about mathematical consciousness science, this talk will not involve any mathematics. So basically, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and what we do in the lab is to try and study consciousness in different ways. I'll explain more about that. And the goal of this talk, as far as I'm concerned, is to give you an introduction to the way consciousness is being studied and share some of my thoughts about the problems that we are having in the field and how I think we should maybe try to solve them by studying consciousness differently. So I invite every one of you, if you're interested in talking more about these topics or trying to think together how we can use mathematics in order to test these types of questions that we're interested in, together, I'm more than happy to do so. So what I'm going to talk about today, first, of course, I will give some introduction to the problem. Then I will present three types of solutions. One is changing the stimuli, the other is changing the methods, and finally, changing the questions that we are asking. So first, let's understand what the problem is and why do I think that we might be studying the wrong thing. So this is one of the most well-known metaphors for conscious versus unconscious processing. You can find it in, Freud's writing, in Leibniz's writings, where basically the idea is that conscious processes are like the tip of the iceberg. These are only a small fraction of the processes that actually take place in our mind. And under the surface of the water, we have many unconscious processes that take place all the time. And one of the questions is, if this is indeed the case, A, how deep do these unconscious processes go? And B, what is the difference between conscious and unconscious processes? If indeed we have two types of processes, then what differentiates between them? And with time, people have suggested different types of dissociations between conscious and unconscious processing. One famous dissociation was between integrative and encapsulated processes, the idea being that unconscious processes are encapsulated so that every module can perform the type of process that it is used to perform. For example, process faces, process words or letters and so on. But if you need integration of information across modules, across senses, and so on, across modalities, there you need conscious processing. Another dissociation claimed that while unconscious processes are habitual, conscious processes allow flexibility. And perhaps the most well-known example that is typically given for this type of dissociation is, let's assume that you move to a new apartment and you're driving to your new apartment, but you're talking to a friend over the phone, and suddenly you find yourself in your old apartment because you unconsciously drove there and automatically kind of relied on your habits, while if you were consciously engaged in driving rather than talking with someone else, you would have been able to get to where you wanted to go. And another dissociation which is related is that unconscious processes are automatic. We cannot control them. We could only control conscious processes. The thing is that with time, we see that these dissociations have also been put into question. So there have been studies claiming, well, you know what? You could actually control unconscious processes. And you can, for example, show that there is an activation of the executive system, and you can show executive functions even without awareness. Others show that you could be flexible. You could, for example, change your strategy without awareness. And there is an ongoing debate from which I was even a part of, changing my mind once I thought that you could perform high-level integration without awareness. Today, I think that maybe you cannot perform such integration without awareness. But it became some kind of a race where people try to show that more and more functions that were previously ascribed to conscious processes could actually be performed also during unconscious processing. And this also gave rise to theories like Yes It Can by Ran Hassin, claiming that basically every function that could be performed consciously could also be performed unconsciously. But having said all that, what I would like us to do now is to take a step back and ask, how do we operationalize the phenomena of consciousness? So how do we study conscious and unconscious processes in the lab? And are we doing it in the right way? So what is typically being done? We take a subject, that subject sits in front of a computer, we present some stimulus, let's say consciously, and we record the behavioral activity or the neural activity while the subject is processing that stimulus. And then what we do is we use different types of highly elegant psychophysical manipulations in order to render that stimulus invisible, and then ask, but do we still see the same behavioral response or the same neural response? And if so, we infer that that subject actually unconsciously processed that piece of information. But how do we render the stimulus invisible? Well, we have different methods to do so. And I imagine that most of you are well aware with these methods. If not, feel free to stop me and ask. I will just go over them briefly. So we can take, for example, a stimulus and embed it within noise and show that at some point subjects are unable to see the stimulus, for example, the butterfly or the face, but we still get neural activation or some behavioral response to another visible stimulus, let's say in priming, that tells us that although they say we don't see anything, they actually process that information. Another very well-known and widely used paradigm is masking. And in masking, what you can do is take a stimulus, present it very briefly, again, embedded within a series of masks here, meaningless stimuli. And what happens is that subjects won't see the masked stimulus. We can use crowding, where we embed a stimulus within an area of masks or flankers that crowd that stimulus and prevent it from being seen. We can use continuous flash suppression, where a different image is presented to each eye. One of them is a flashing area of colorful patterns, Mondrians, and that could render the stimulus invisible for a few seconds even. And we can also use attention, like the famous gorilla experiment, where we direct subjects' attention elsewhere, and they might miss or not see even highly visible, highly salient stimuli, like the gorilla in that case. And I will say, I won't get into that, but one thing that we are working on in the lab now is actually an overview of the methods that have been used in the field and how they have actually been differently used by different theories to test these theories and check and examine the neural correlates of consciousness. And the results are pretty interesting in terms of which paradigms are more popular, which paradigms support which theories, and so on. But unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that. I'm happy to discuss that a bit later on. So let me give you an example of a few experiments that we conducted in our lab using these techniques and these paradigms. So for example, and everything here is relatively new, so most of it has not been published. So I'm sharing with you some unpublished data, which still needs to be replicated. Let's see if this works or not. So in this work that has been led by Dr. Amir Tal, a postdoc in my lab now doing the second postdoc in Columbia University, and Oren Beirav. And what we try to do there is see whether we can get contextual cueing without awareness. In contextual cueing, what happens is that subjects are exposed to a specific context, and with more and more exposures to that context, they learn it implicitly without even knowing that this is what they're doing, and they become faster and faster in a task, for example, here in a visual search task, where they have to detect a specific target amongst an area of distractors. So here, for example, subjects were asked to detect a T that is rotated 90 degrees to the right within an area of non-Ts, so stimuli that look like T, but there aren't Ts. And we presented these areas repeatedly. And then after the first test, we had a training session where basically we used CFS. So one image is flashed with flickering stimuli, one eye is flashed with flickering stimuli, and the other eye is only exposed to a pairing between a face, a specific face, and the target T stimulus. I hope that you can see that in the central display. And then we test again, now with awareness. So what happens here is that subjects see these pairs of faces and targets unconsciously again and again. And we ask, will that help them when they consciously see the same display, now with the distractors as well? And what we find is that it does. So the more they get exposure, unconscious exposure to these contextual cues, to these pairings between faces and targets, the better they become in detecting the target. So the faster they are. And this is interesting because this is the first demonstration of contextual cueing without awareness. So far what people have shown is that you get contextual cueing when subjects consciously search and look at the display, but they just don't know that they are learning something. So it's implicit learning. Here we show that this can be done not only implicitly, but also unconsciously. Now we pre-registered this and we are trying to replicate it. Of course, with COVID, replication takes way slower. So we started retesting subjects only relatively recently, and subjects flow is not that high as it was, but hopefully if I talk to you within a few months, I'll have an answer about the replicability of this finding. A different type of experiment tried to ask, could subjects integrate congruent, could they integrate objects and scenes without awareness? So this actually goes into a whole series of studies where at first I thought that subjects could integrate the objects and the scene unconsciously. Later on, this result was not replicated by another lab, and then we launched a full wide-scale replication project in our own lab, and we also couldn't find evidence for unconscious integration. We did that then with fMRI, and this is a study where we tried to test with EEG whether there are any markers of unconscious integration of objects and scenes. How did we do that? We took objects, you can see here in the congruent and incongruent examples above. We presented scenes in which the critical object was either congruent with the scene, like the bouquet here, or incongruent with the scene, like the dynamite bomb within the wedding scenery. And we also had a condition where these objects were completely scrambled. And we asked basically during conscious and unconscious processes, would we be able to find markers that A, differentiate between objects and non-objects, which we expected to find, and B, most importantly, differentiated between congruent and incongruent. And this speaks to the dissociation between conscious and unconscious processing, either involving integration or not. And what we found was that during conscious processing on the left, you can see clear differences between, first of all, scrambled and intact objects, so scrambled in red, intact in blue. But also, if you focus on the, I cannot find my marker now, so I'll just, if you focus on the about 300 millisecond time window, you could see there differences between congruent in dark blue and incongruent intact scenes. And if you look at the same neural activity that we find in EEG during unconscious processing on the right, you could see that although we have a nice separation between scrambled and intact, which of course might also stem from low-level differences in the images themselves, we find no evidence for a differentiation between congruent and incongruent images. So this is the types of studies that would try to claim, no, there is no integration during unconscious processing. Final study that I will present here, again using masking, try to ask, could we integrate a visible object with an invisible context? So we took one of the most well-known stimuli in psychology, the B13 stimulus, an ambiguous stimulus that could either be perceived as B or as 13, depending on the context in which it appears. And in this work by Dan Biderman and Yarden Shir, I, by the way, failed to mention the students who are responsible for this work, Itai Linzen, Alisa Truman, who's now doing her PhD in San Diego, UCSD, and Inbal Gur Aryeh. Itai and Inbal are still in my lab. And what Dan, who's now also in Colombia, and Yarden have done in this experiment was basically to take the context, the A and the C, or the 12 and the 14, and present them, only mask them. So the B and 13 were always visible, but what subjects did not see was the A and the C, the context, the contextual inducers. And what we found was that during conscious processing, of course, we have a very strong modulation by the context. You can see that on the left. And in two unconscious experiments, again, pre-registered, we find a tiny, tiny effect of context. So you can see that the blue curve is a bit higher than the orange one. And this actually is an example. So we are very proud of this study. We published it, everything is fine. But I think what all these studies also show us is the limitations of unconscious processing studies. And let's dwell on that for a second. So one thing that is very clear from these, from comparing the graph on the left to the two graphs on the right, is that the signals that we get for unconscious processing are extremely weak. And this is why the problem, the challenge of replicating results is even bigger when it comes to unconscious processing. We take stimuli, and we kind of run over them with masking, with stimulus degradation. We present them at low contrast. We present them for 17 milliseconds. And then it comes as no surprise that the neural activity and the behavioral responses are very weak for these types of stimuli. So we are kind of chasing this wild goose that is very hard to catch. Second, even after a few decades of studying conscious and unconscious processing, we still have a very strong disagreement about the proper way to measure awareness. And there has been a highly interesting and thought-provoking paper by David Shanks recently, claiming that maybe most of our findings are merely statistical confounds that result from regression to the mean, rather than index a genuine unconscious effect. Even more importantly, I don't know if it's more important, but no less important, is the conceptual issue. So what do these results really mean? And basically, the metaphor that I like that was given by Hakwan Lau and also Christoph Koch at some point was that we are asking what the function of consciousness is in these types of studies. So we say we can read without consciousness, it's not reading. We can integrate information without consciousness, so the function of consciousness is not integration of information. We can infer emotion without awareness. But if you kind of examine the logic of these studies, going back to that metaphor, it's basically like asking what is the function of legs? And taking a subject, let's assume that we had IRBs and ethical approval for that, cutting off that subject's legs, and showing that that subject could still move in space. And then reaching the conclusion that the function of legs is not to move in space, because we could also move in space without legs. Here, it is clear to us that this logic does not work. But this is exactly what we do in all these types of studies about unconscious processing. We take a subject, we cut off her consciousness. We create a very unique lab-induced situation and show that in that peculiar, unique situation, that subject is able to read or do math or integrate information or what have you. And what we should ask is, what does that mean? Does it mean that the function of consciousness is not to integrate information? I don't think so. Maybe we just hit a kind of a borderline case where this can be done without awareness. That doesn't mean that in everyday processes, this is what's going on. And to add to that is the question of external validity. Now, this is a huge issue because what we do in psychological experiments is to take a theoretical construct, memory, attention, conformity, what have you, and we operationalize it. We create an experiment that tries to mimic that construct in the lab. But we should always ask ourselves, what is the external validity? Is our operational definition valid, or does it capture the theoretical construct that we are trying to study? And I would claim, and I would do that modestly, because this is what we've been doing all the time, that maybe this is not the case for consciousness. Because in real life, you never, ever, I think, see a stimulus for 17 milliseconds embedded in masks. I would claim strongly that you never, ever see a stimulus flashing to one eye and another stimulus presented to the other. So we have now been able to elegantly and beautifully, I wish I would be smart enough to invent these types of paradigms, right? But we have these elegant paradigms that allow us to create an experimental manipulation where once the subject sees the stimulus or experiences the stimulus, and in another trial, they don't see the stimulus. But is that tapping into conscious and unconscious processing in everyday lives? And I would claim that it doesn't. So to me, this is kind of reminiscent of, so what you see here on the right is a photo of artificial eyes. So this is basically a polymer that a syntactic polymer that people use in order to have these skating arenas, that it's not real ice, it's basically a syntactic ice. And to me, this is like studying consciousness. We want to study this iceberg, but we are using a syntactic material or syntactic phenomena. And I'm not sure that the phenomena that we probe in the lab is the same one as the one that we want to study. We want to ask in everyday life, what processes are being done consciously and what processes are being done unconsciously. I'm walking down the street and everything is happening around me. And I'm thinking about something, but in the background, we assume that we unconsciously process a lot of information. And these studies are supposed to tell us what type of information we're processing unconsciously in everyday life. But I'm not sure that this is what they're doing. And it always reminds me of a story of a friend of mine who called me once furious after parent-teachers meeting. And she said, the teacher said that my son cannot concentrate in class and she wants me to take him to be diagnosed. Maybe he has ADHD. And I told her, that doesn't make sense because at home, when he plays the computer, he can focus for 4 hours. And I told my friend, well, yes, but maybe the things that we can do in front of a computer don't always translate to what we do in the real world. And true enough, computers are part of the real world more and more now, especially during these times in COVID and so on. But I'm not sure that the experimental manipulations that we use in the lab actually represent the unconscious processes that we're interested in outside the lab. And what I will try to present today are 3 ways by which we try to overcome this problem. And I invite every one of you, if you have other ideas, come to us. We'll be happy to work together on probing real life unconscious processes. So how do we do that? One thing we can do is to change the stimuli that we are studying. Another thing we can do is change the methods. And the final thing is to actually change the questions. So I'll start with changing the stimuli. So this work is a project of the PhD work of Uri Koriski, who's actually the first PhD student in my lab. We're fairly young, our lab. And what Uri has, I've been talking about this a lot. It's kind of like an existential crisis of a consciousness researcher, thinking that maybe the methods that we're using are not good enough. So one day Uri came to me and said, you know what, I know that this is not going to be very ecologically valid, but maybe we could try to suppress real life objects like this iPhone, for example, rather than pictures that are presented on screen. And that would make our experiments a bit more ecological. And there is a reason to do so, because we know that real-life objects are processed differently than 2D images. They are learned earlier, they are remembered better, they grab your attention, and they also evoke different neural activations. But we are limited by our own methods. So far, we've only been suppressing pictures on the screen. And Uri said, maybe we can take this continuous flash suppression method and use augmented reality in order to suppress actual things in the real world. So I'll show you a presentation, a small video. I hope that it will be broadcasted well enough.
So do you see a red and green frame around this window?
Yes.
And the red cross in the middle?
Yes.
Okay, great. They are presented on your glasses.
Mm-hmm. So just to explain, this is Uri, this is the subject. She's wearing the augmented reality goggles. We are going to present CFS stimulation on one of the goggles, and the other eye is going to be completely transparent. So the other eye is continuously getting information about the stimuli in the real world, and the dominant eye is getting these flashes of colorful Mondrians that prevent the subject from seeing what's presented in front of her. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so they are presented on your glasses. Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to put something behind this curtain, and I'm going to drop the curtain, but we're going to present you with flashing circles. And what I want you to do is I want you to tell me once you see something that is not the flashing circles. Okay? Okay? Mm-hmm. So here we go. Do you see the flashing circles?
Yes.
Do you see anything else?
No.
How about now?
Flashing circles?
Okay. And now?
Still the circles?
Okay. Close your right eye. Your right eye. Okay.
Oh! I see your face.
Okay. Great. So whatever is presented to your left eye is suppressed because of the circles that will present to your right eye.
Okay, so this is, of course, only a demonstration. This is not how the experiment really takes place. Usually it looks more or less like that. So we present, so the subject sees we have this device. We see the curtain is coming up. This is what the subject sees. And then the CFS stimulation starts. And at some point, the stimulus would emerge into awareness. And this is very nice because it allows us to now ask new questions. But before we can ask these new questions, we had to validate this methodology to show that it works. So what Uri did was to so our lab kind of became a arts and crafts workshop for a few months. Uri gathered all these real-life objects. He brought a photographer that would take photos of these objects in the device. Then we went to a graphic studio where we printed 2D replicas of these 2D photos of these objects, the photographs that were taken, and we took extra care in order to make sure that the colors would match as much as we could. And then at the end of the day, we had, so what you see here on the left is the 3D object. On the right are two printed out images of that object. So you can see that it looks fairly similar. And what Uri did together with Ronnie Hirschhorn was to present subjects with these real objects and photographs and measure first in how many of the trials these remained invisible for 4 seconds, if I remember correctly. And also what were subjects' objective performance. So were they able to say if the objects were presented on the right or on the left? And as you can see here, we see that this methodology or this technique is able to render the stimuli invisible for 80% of the trials. Note that it does so more effectively for photographs than for real objects. And we can also see on the right that when subjects say that they don't see the stimulus, they are indeed a chance in saying whether the stimulus was on the right or on the left, which is, of course, nice. And then we wanted to see how long this suppression lasts, and we show that for real objects, it's about 6 seconds, a bit less than 6 seconds. For photographs, a bit over that. So we have relatively long suppression duration, and we also see a hint that it might be that real objects actually break suppression faster than 2D images. So one thing that was interesting was to ask, is this phenomena a low-level one or a high-level one? So does that stem from the reflectivity of the real objects, which would be the lower-level explanation and the least interesting one? Could that stem from just the depth that is being inferred from monocular cues? Or could it be the fact that real objects are indeed real and they have affordances and we know what to do with them? And maybe this is why these objects break into awareness faster. So in order to test that, Uri did what every common PhD student would do, which is to go crazy. And he actually designed 3D models of these objects, and then he printed them in a 3D printer. So now for every object, we had the 3D model of that object, and all of the models were printed in a matte format. So there was no reflectivity, no shining parts anymore. And then what he also did was to create scrambled versions of these objects. And this allowed us to have a very nice 2x2 design that could distill the low and high level influences of these objects. So we had meaningful and meaningless stimuli that were either 2D printed or 3D printed. And then if the effect that we found before only stems from the shininess or the fact that the 3D objects were simply more shinier than the 2D images, then we would expect to find no difference in this experiment. If, on the other hand, the difference stems from the 3D objects being 3D versus 2D, so depth cues and so on, then we would expect both meaningful and meaningless stimuli to emerge into awareness faster than the 2D stimuli. And if this is indeed about affordances, and I hope everyone here knows what affordances are. These are the motor plans that are afforded by the object. So for example, the affordance of this water bottle is to do something like that, and so on. So we have stored a motor knowledge about objects. Then we would expect a difference to be found only for the meaningful condition. So this manipulation allowed us to tease apart the different contributions to the effect that we found. And Uri ran 2 experiments, and in the 2 experiments, especially in the second experiment that was way more powerful, we found a clear effect for the intact object and no effect for the scrambled ones. So what you see here, each point here is an individual subject, and the axis depict the difference between 2D and 3D stimuli. And no effect was found for the scrambled ones. You can see here the mean for the 2 conditions. So this basically showed us that for meaningful objects, 3D stimuli emerge into awareness faster than 2D pictures, but this was not the case for the meaningless stimuli. So this is interesting. It means that 3D objects emerge faster, but only when intact. So Uri has now submitted this work, and it's very interesting, but the most interesting part still lies ahead, because now what we can do with Uri's paradigm, and I welcome each and every one of you who wants to use it for your own experiments, is first, hopefully, we would get stronger effects. So imagine how powerful it is when you study emotional expressions, not using images that subjects cannot see, but using an actor that stands in front of them, and they still cannot see them because of the suppression, but that actor is either upset or angry or frightened and so on. So we expect the signal to be stronger. More importantly, now Uri can use, and this is what he's doing this year, can use this paradigm that he developed in order to test the very well-known dissociation between vision for action and vision for perception. Because now we can check whether subjects can interact with objects that they don't even see. And this is a question that was completely outside the reach of scientific investigation thus far, because we didn't have methods to do that. I should say that there are also solutions using virtual reality that could allow you to manipulate virtual objects, but here we have real intact objects that you can feel and you can touch and you can interact with without seeing them. If this is the case, that would be very interesting and a very strong support in the 2 visual streams hypothesis. So this is one route that we've taken to change the stimuli. Another route is to change the methods that we're using. And here we are trying to create a situation where we have stronger signals and paradigms that have stronger or higher external validity. And the idea here was to say, let's take the gorilla experiment. I think the gorilla experiment is probably one of the most ecologically valid experiments that one has to study unconscious processes. Because here, this is a situation that happens to us all the time, especially nowadays where we are kind of, our heads are sunk into the cell phone and we just don't see everything that happens around us. around us. And this could happen to us on a day-to-day basis. Of course, this manipulates consciousness via attention. So we are using one psychological faculty in order to probe another. But the problem with the gorilla experiment is that you can only do it once. So you do it once, and then subjects always see the gorilla. What we are trying to develop, and this is work in collaboration with Meir Plotnik in Shiba, started by Dan Biderman and led now by Ronnie Hirschhorn. This is a study where we are using a 3D dome to project a scenario, a street scenario, while subjects are walking. And what we are trying to do is to present stimuli in their environment, but have them be engaged in a very demanding attentional task that mimics the gorilla experiment. So basically what we are doing here, and now we are actually programming a virtual reality in-lab version of that experiment. I don't know if you can see, but in the middle, I'll start the movie soon and the video soon and you could see that. But in the middle, there are 3 bees, and we circle one of them, and the task of that subject is to follow, excuse me, the bee that we circled. And when the subject is walking along the side of the road, there are billboards. And in these billboards, we project highly distressing emotional images taken from the IAPS data set. I don't know if you guys had a chance to ever see these images. Some of them are very gross, like children with tumors and mutilated bodies, really things that you don't want to see. But there are also neutral images. So we present emotional and neutral images while the subject is walking. And we are trying to see if we can get to a stage where, due to the task that is becoming more and more difficult as the game progresses, we are able to get the subject not to see these images, but we can still pick up on traces, GSR, EEG, and others that allow that subject, that indicate that the subject is still processing that information unconsciously. So I'll show you how this looks like. So the bees are moving. You can see on the side, we have images. Some of them are scrambled, some of them are not. And at the end of the trial, we take both subjective and objective measures to see whether the subject was able to see the billboards. She says here that she didn't see anything. And when we ask her to choose which one of the 4 images was actually presented, what we get is that at about 75% of the trial, subjects report seeing nothing. And in these trials, they are indeed a chance. So they cannot detect which image was presented. Now, this is the very beginning of this experiment. We've been working on it for a couple of years now, but it's not an easy experiment to program and to run. And now everything stopped again due to COVID, but we hope that we'll be able to get back to that relatively soon. But what we find interesting in these types of paradigms is that they simulate everyday unconscious processing. So now this is not an approximation. This is not an artificial paradigm that we created that probes perhaps, again, an artificial form of unconscious processing. But this mimics what happens in everyday lives. We hope that we will get stronger effects because the stimuli are huge. They remain in the environment for a few seconds. And it applies in-lab measures of awareness on an out-of-lab study. So we take subjective and objective measures. We use the knowledge that has been developed in the field for a few decades now in order to understand what's going on in the subject's mind. I will say again that we manipulate consciousness via attention. So we have to bear that in mind. But I would hold that in real life, that's at least the way I think about it, in most cases, what determines what comes into our awareness or not is actually attention. I will end with a third way to solve this problem, which is to change the question to begin with. And here I will resort to a work that I've done during my postdoc with Uri Maoz, Christoph Koch, who was our mentor, and Ralph Adolphs, and also Gideon Yaffe from Yale, who is a philosopher. And this work is an example of the way philosophers and neuroscientists can join forces to ask empirical questions that are philosophically informed. And we were interested in the long tradition of free will studies, initiated famously by Benjamin Libet in the 80s. As you probably know or heard, what Libet did was to ask subjects to move their finger whenever they felt the conscious urge to do so. He recorded the EEG activity, he recorded the EMG activity to know exactly when they moved their finger, and he also asked them to report where was this dot on a rotating dot on a stationary clock when they felt the conscious urge to move. And he was interested in the relations between the conscious experience of wanting to move, the movement itself, and the neural activity that precedes the movement. And what Libet famously found was that the awareness or the intention to move, the reported intention to move, was about 200 milliseconds before the actual contraction of the muscles. But more importantly, the readiness potential, an EEG waveform, EEG negativity that builds up towards movement, actually started to increase about half a second before that. And this, as you might know, was famously taken as evidence against free will. Books have been written on it, papers in philosophy, in psychology, in neuroscience, and so forth. But going back to the question of what we are really probing, Uri and myself were asking, are we testing free will in the way we should? Is this a good enough manipulation or operational definition of voluntary action? And in order to understand this point better, we went back to philosophy, and we went back to a philosophical paper written in the 70s by Ulan Margalit and Morgenbesser, where they differentiated between two types of decision. So a choosing decision is when you go to the supermarket, this is portrayed on the right. You go to the supermarket and you don't know which milk you want to get. Do you want to get the whole milk or the skim, the low-fat one? Do you want to get the expensive or the cheap? Do you want this brand or that brand? And you are weighing in different reasons and factors in order to make a decision. This is very different than a situation where you go to the supermarket and you already know which brand you want, and now you see a line of completely identical milk bottles or milk cartons whose expiring date is exactly the same, and you just pick one, randomly out of this line. One more. And picking decisions, they're defined by being unreasoned. So you cannot reason your way out of this decision. You just randomly pick one out of that line of milk bottles. And usually they're also non-consequential because it doesn't really matter which one you pick. Choosing decisions, on the other hand, are reasoned, and usually or almost always they have consequences. So what we wanted to do was to create an experiment. We said, wait, when people exert volitional action in their everyday lives, they usually, or when they think about voluntary action, they usually think about choosing and not about picking. And now this is a matter of debate. I'm happy to discuss that later on in the question part. But I would hold that when people talk about free will, they don't really care about the situation where you pick randomly a milk bottle out of a line. They care about moral responsibility. And this is usually the context where free will is discussed. And moral responsibility is about choosing. So we said, what would happen to that famous readiness potential who's been studied for 30 years now if we study it in the context of choosing decisions and not picking one? So what we did was to present subjects with two causes, and they had to choose to which cause they want to donate. And basically what we did, we tailor-made the experiment for each and every subject. So at the beginning, they rated the organizations and how much they would like to donate to these organizations. And we created trials based on their preferences. So we had easy trials where the decision was between two organizations that are different in at least 4 points between them, or hard trials where the decision was between two organizations that only differ in 1 point between them. And subjects knew that at the end, of the experiment, we will have a lottery, and one trial would be chosen. And for that trial, we will actually donate $1,000 in the name of that subject to that organization. So they knew that every decision that they would make could amount to an actual donation of $1,000. There was also the picking condition. In the picking condition, irrespective of what you pressed, both organizations would get $500. So again, you're presented with two causes. Again, you're pressing right or left, but as opposed to the choosing condition where your decision made a difference and you had to reason which organization you prefer, here, whatever you chose, both organizations would get the same amount of money. So we had this block design with deliberate blocks and arbitrary blocks. Every once in a while, we had a memory test to make sure subjects are paying attention in both types of trials. And I'll show you first the behavior. So the behavior showed very nicely that, that subjects were indeed following instructions. So what you see here on the left are reaction times. Blue dots are individual subjects. The x-axis marks reaction times in hard decisions. The y-axis marks reaction times in easy decisions. And as you can see here, for the blue decisions, the blue dots, they are on the diagonal, meaning that the difficulty of the decision didn't really make a difference with respect to reaction times in arbitrary or picking trials. But when you look at the red dots, which are the same subjects now in the deliberate condition, you see two things. First, you see that the decisions take much longer when they are deliberate, which makes sense. And secondly, you see that they take even longer when they are hard decisions. Because it's easy when you have to choose if you want to donate to cancer or to pro-guns organizations. But if you have to choose now between donating to cancer research or helping the poor, then you need to think about it. And subjects thought about it for about 2.5 seconds here. On the right, you see the consistency between subjects' ratings at the beginning of the experiment and the actual choices that they've made. And here, again, this confirms the behavioral manipulation. Because you can see that for the deliberate trials in red, subjects in easy trials, they are almost 100% consistent with their own preferences. So they always choose the organization they preferred. And in hard decisions, they're about 80% consistent, which makes sense. But on arbitrary trials, they are more or less around 50%, with a small difference for the easier decisions. So this is the behavior. So we know already that we can get subjects to make arbitrary and deliberate decisions for the very same visual input and the very same motor output. But the meaning of the decision is different. What happens in the brain? Will we find the readiness potential in both conditions? So I'll first show you the data from individual subjects. I'm a big fan of showing individual data rather than bar plots. So you can see here, this is the picking, the arbitrary condition. We have readiness potentials for most of our subjects, as you might expect. And this is the deliberate condition. No readiness potential whatsoever. This, of course, slope is significant for arbitrary decision. The slope for deliberate ones is not significant. If you look now at the average waveform, then you could see that the deliberate decisions show no evidence for readiness potential. Also, the distribution seems different, but there is a strong readiness potential for the picking or arbitrary condition. So what is going on here? And this is where we have a little bit of mathematics, and I should say this is inspired by the work of Aaron Scherger, the 2012 PNAS paper, where Aaron suggested that the readiness potential might not index a genuine component indexing an unconscious decision, but is rather consistent with an account where you have random fluctuations, just stochastic random fluctuations of activity in the brain. And when these cross a threshold by accident, by chance, this is when subjects move. And because we always lock our ERPs to movement onset, these random fluctuations are accumulated, and this creates a waveform, something that looks like an ERP. And what Uri Maoz did, who's my main collaborator on this project, and we've basically done all this work together, is to take Aaron's computational model and adopt it to differentiate between deliberate and arbitrary trials. And I don't have time to go into the details. I'm happy to do so later on if someone is interested. But you can see the prediction of this model saying, if we only record random fluctuations, if we only record noise, how would the activity look like in CZ, in the electrode from which we record the readiness potential? And the prediction is that for arbitrary decisions, we will get something that gradually builds up towards movement. But for deliberate decisions, where the factor that drives the decision is not the noise, but rather value weighing, we wouldn't get that effect. So to conclude, we conclude that the readiness potential may reflect noise accumulation rather than unconscious decisions. And accordingly, it is found in arbitrary decisions and not in deliberate ones. And this, of course, challenges previous accounts of voluntary action. But the main point I want to make here is that when we ask the question differently, when we manipulated or operationally defined volitional action differently, we got a completely different result. So if Benjamin Libet had probed meaningful decisions rather than arbitrary ones, maybe we wouldn't be discussing the illusion of free will so much in the last 30 years. So the way you ask your questions matters. The way you manipulate consciousness matters. And the stimuli that you use, that you suppress, also make a difference. So I would like to end with this beautiful quote. I use it all the time. This is taken from the International Dictionary of Psychology. The year is 1989. And the formal definition of consciousness by Stuart Sutherland, again in 1989, it's not that way back in the past. Some of us were alive, I was alive back then, is the following. Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written on it. And I think this skepticism has been a strong driving force for the forefathers and foremothers of our field, trying to show that consciousness can be studied experimentally. And this forced them to invent these, as I said before, highly elegant, beautiful methods to create a very well-controlled situation in the lab where subjects sometimes see a stimulus and sometimes don't. But these paradigms, beautiful and elegant as they were, are also artificial in many ways. And I'm not sure that they actually probe the very same processes that we are interested in. And you can see that the field has been trying to persuade and autocorrect and discuss how to measure consciousness well enough and what are the good methods. And I think that we got so carried away in our strive for good enough methods to study consciousness that we got too far away from the original construct that we wanted to study. So I hope that I managed to persuade you that the current methods of the field, which are again beautiful, and I use them all the time. So I don't think we should resort them. But I do think that we should question their validity, and we should ask what exactly these findings mean when we find them. Before I open the discussion for questions, one last slide. I wanted to tell you about a project that I've been involved with, or actually co-leading together with Lucia Meloni and Michael Pitts. And this project is trying to test through adversarial collaboration two leading theories of consciousness: global neuronal workspace and integrated information theory. And the unique thing about this project, which has been also generously funded by the Templeton Foundation, is that we join together the two proponents of the theories, Stanislas Dehaene on the one hand and Giulio Tononi on the other hand, and together these two giants think about experiments that could test their theories. And it was a hell of a job trying to get them to agree about experiments that could test their theories, but we managed to do so. And these experiments are pre-registered, going to be run in 6 different labs around the world, fMRI, MEG, and ECOG. And we are looking for talented postdocs who could join us and analyze this data and be a part of this project that we're very proud of. So I'm taking advantage of this opportunity where we have people who are interested in consciousness. If you have especially computational background, data analysis background, and you're interested in joining us for this project, we have a funded position for a postdoc for 2 years now. So excuse the promotion, but we really want very talented people. So if you are that person, call me, write me an email, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to discuss options with you. And I will end with thanking my amazing lab. I couldn't have done any of this work without them, both conceptually and physically. A great bunch of people, great thinkers, and also all the people that have been working on the projects that I mentioned today. Of course, the funding and also you. So thank you very much. And I'm more than happy to answer any question you might have.